What happens when philosophy turns its attention almost entirely to God? In this video, we're going to explore the medieval era of philosophy, thanks to which questions regarding faith and reason dominate philosophical discussions. And in the process, we'll see how, during this time period, philosophy and theology become very much intertwined. Okay, so then we get our transition into the medieval era. Roughly, we're going to say 476, okay, the fall of the Roman Empire. And then this is going to be a pretty long era in the history of philosophy, almost 1,000 years, you might say. Okay, and we'll just say 1400 is a nice, clear point at which to say the medieval era ends and the modern era begins, okay? So we already referenced earlier kind of what stands out about the medieval era, and that's the God, right? Questions regarding God, philosophy of religion more generally. So let's be honest, most of the time, at least ostensibly, right, all these guys are, and they're mostly guys, right, doing philosophy, or at least ones we hear about during the medieval era. They're not questioning God's existence per se. Now, they might have debates and discussions about what the best proof or argument for God's existence is, but a lot of the discussion wasn't necessarily about God's existence, but more, what must God be like? Right? Granted, God exists. What is God like? So, God's existence is one sort of type of question, and God's essence then is another kind of aspect of the philosophy of religion, and that received a lot of attention and discussion as well. So one way or another, lots of questions regarding God and more generally the philosophy of religion are, really what stand out when it comes to the medieval era. One theme I like to draw our attention to, as I mentioned, I think that's the third bullet point there on the slide, is you did get a lot, this is a recurring theme, you get a lot of appreciation on the part of the medieval thinkers for the ancient philosophers who preceded them. A lot of admiration. They were usually pretty familiar with, the medieval thinkers were pretty familiar with, well-versed with the ancient philosophers. And you had a lot of admiration. And so some of them are known as being like pretty much scholars when it comes to the ancient thinkers. So for example, a lot of us have heard of Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. Right? He is very much known as being an Aristotelian. And in fact, when you read Aquinas, he reads a lot like Aristotle. So methodologically, they proceed very similarly. Aquinas is going to use a lot of the same terminology, conceptually proceeds very similarly. So like Aristotle is very fond of talking in terms of telos, teleology, or the idea that things have functions or purposes, right? And Aquinas inherits that same kind of lingo. So that's just another example again of a medieval thinker who kind of marries an ancient philosopher with his own theology. Right? So Aquinas very much known for being influenced heavily by Aristotle, and it shines through in his works. Okay, so I was saying, so along the same lines, right, I was pointing out Aquinas very much influenced by Aristotle. The same is true of Augustine, right? Maybe you guys have heard of St. Augustine or St. Augustine as well, pretty famous name. But he was actually very much influenced by Plato, not Aristotle. So, and so for example, Augustine's famous book is called The Confessions, right? You can see again kind of how Plato very strongly influenced Augustine. So Augustine marrying Plato's thought with his own theology, right? So again, that's a reoccurring trend that you see in a lot of the medieval thinkers. Okay, so in terms of prominent thinkers, a lot of us, even non-philosophers, right, even coming into the class without any exposure to philosophy, probably had heard of these two names. Okay, Aquinas, or maybe one of them. Okay, Aquinas and Augustine, right? Not so much Anselm. He's a little bit more obscure. Now, if you did have a class in philosophy, or more specifically philosophy of religion, maybe you have some awareness of Anselm. We're actually going to tackle Anselm later in section 3, so we'll get acquainted with his famous ontological argument for God's existence. But these three saints are, by far, at least in my mind, the most famous medieval thinkers. So AAA, you'll notice the acronym there. Hopefully that's helpful for you. Any questions on the medieval era? As we move out of medieval philosophy, we'll see that things change dramatically in philosophy. In the next era, in the next video, we're going to see that the modern thinkers turn our attention towards what we can know and what we have good reason to doubt.